personally, menopause has been a journey that's taken me in a great big loop back to when I was about 10. And, feeling pre-sexuality, pre-gender, who was I really?
Yeah.
And that's been very exciting and very, very interesting. So there's a sort of parallel piece there around who am I becoming and what am I? And really, I think for me personally, the identity woman is something that I don't really hold anymore.
I'm Cindy Darnell, and welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, cultural, political, and other lenses, and find some ways to explore some very diverse erotic quandaries. Today's guest on The Erotic Philosopher is Tania Glyde. Tania is a psychotherapist in private practice in London, specializing with gender, sex, and relationship diverse clients, offering both individual and relationship therapy. In 2014, they founded the London Gender, Sex, and Relationship Diversity Practice. Tania has published 3 books and has written for The Lancet and Lancet Psychiatry. They've recently published a paper about the LGBTQ+ experience of menopause, which informs our discussion today. How can therapists and other healthcare practitioners best support and validate their queer menopausal clients? While some of the information in today's podcast is of a medical nature, neither Tania nor myself are qualified to give medical advice. Please do see a doctor or registered medical professional in your area for medical advice about menopause. Enjoy this conversation with Tania Glyde. Tania Glyde, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher. I'm really, really glad to have you here as a guest.
It's really great to see you, and it's great to be here.
And just for a little bit of context for people listening, you and I have known each other, I think we sort of encountered each other in London maybe about 8 or 9 years ago now, which is pretty remarkable.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, we've been following each other's work for that time, and in that time I've known you as a psychotherapist and a sex therapist. But for people who are encountering your work for the first time or encountering you for the first time, what would you like people to know about you?
How long have we got? I know we haven't got all day. Psychotherapist and counsellor specialising in GSRD, gender, gender, sex and relationship diversity. I also have a strong interest in somatic sexuality, sex education, that kind of thing. I did some training around that. I've been an author, published several books. I guess I was a creative in media in my life before, and then I retrained as a therapist. So I've always had a strong interest in mental health and also in sexuality, sex and sexuality.
Yeah. And so now your current incarnation in the field of mental health and sex and sexuality is your research and interest in menopause, and in particular, what you're calling queer menopause. And so for people listening who may or may not be familiar with menopause in general, and then certainly queer menopause, I'd be interested to hear your take on, firstly, how you would describe menopause, and then how that sits in contrast or perhaps in comparison to queer menopause. How do these two parts fit together based on your research and your experience?
I'll speak about people who have ovaries, because menopause is a biopsychosocial phenomenon. Obviously, people, it's we could say the mind, the body, the outside world, the society we're in, ageism and age and how we're perceived. But essentially, a person with ovaries in middle age, or who's had them removed surgically, the estrogen levels start to fluctuate and reduce. And gradually the end point of that is infertility. Period, stop. And the person,
so that's the bio part of it.
That's the sort of bio part. Now there's a previous section called perimenopause, which people know less about. Lots of people have heard of menopause. They might have maybe heard their mother mention it or something. Perimenopause is the long phase where that estrogen changing process starts, and it can be long. It can be 10 years, it can be 15 years. And gradually that process, some people might be very short, some people might hardly notice anything, other people might notice their periods, which were previously very regular, becoming very irregular, or gradually over time. Mood swings, mood changes, skin dryness, vaginal changes. There's all kinds of things that will gradually come on and may for many people be highly confusing, because they haven't been told. And I think, I've certainly spent in the past, before GPs who were on the case, sort of staggering in and out of clinics, as it were, sort of saying, what is this? What is this? Nobody mentioned it.
So how would someone know if they were in perimenopause? What are some of the symptoms?
Body-wide dryness, dry mouth, dry skin, dry vagina, genitals, all of that. Weight gain. And again, it's contentious around weight gain because it is seen as quite sort of heteronormative to be worried about weight gain in menopause, and it's quite overpowering the amount that it's discussed. However, any bodily change that you weren't expecting may be distressing. So, it is a thing that people comment on.
And there's costs involved if you have to get a whole new wardrobe and your clothes don't fit, or it causes you injuries, back pain and various things.
This is it. Body pain throughout the body. That is also another side effect. Different. All of this is different levels for different people. Some people will hardly notice it, and their periods will stop one day, and they'll go, "Oh, is that it?" Other people become so unwell they have to give up work. Sometimes for several years, sometimes forever. So, and most people are somewhere in the middle. I think there are 40 main ones that are listed on a menopause website, which I've listed on my own website, of all the different things. Periods that were very regular then becoming irregular and sometimes very heavy. And sometimes they become so heavy that the person can't leave the house. I mean, it's that bad for some people at some points. And periods can disappear for a few months and people think, I'm nearly there, I'm 11 months in, and then boom, the periods come back. So it's kind of gaslighting. The body kind of gaslights you. I mean, just to say, the anxiety, the pain, and all the things can contribute to insomnia. And it's the lack of sleep which then will feed. It's a feedback loop. It's lack of sleep. It's feeling more anxious, more depressed, more unwell. And it's the lack of sleep. It's quite murderous, actually. You can be lying in bed and you do not know whether your body is hot or cold. It is literally hot and cold at the same time, and sometimes at the same time in different parts of the body. And then, of course, there's the sweating and the hot flushes. Of course, how could I have not mentioned the hot flushes? And those are really interesting for the social elements of what it is like to be seen as someone who's blushing.
Yeah.
And blushing has associations with awkwardness, naivety.
It's like a non-consensual vulnerability that your body does despite you.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's non-consensual vulnerability that menopause brings. Again, some people will be shouting and going, but my sex is better than ever, and I feel great. And that's super awesome, because some things do become better than ever. Absolutely. And you realize things that matter to you don't matter anymore, and then some other stuff does matter.
Yeah. And that's the thing about, what we're talking about here is, yes, it's nice to look for commonalities and for us to all bond together and go, well, isn't it lovely we're having this human collective experience together? And at the same time, it's okay for us to recognize difference. It's okay for us to recognize diversity and to say, your experience of a thing, menopause, is vastly different from mine or from another person's. And that in itself is okay. We don't have to have everything be the same, everything to have, consistent, measurable patterns, because life is not very consistent nor measurable. And therein lies the magic. Yeah. Not necessarily the beauty, but the magic of diversity.
The magic of life. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so just to finish on menopause, you are in menopause finally when you haven't had a period for a year.
Right.
And
so that's the official definition, the clinical
That's the official definition. Okay. And then straight after that, you're postmenopausal.
Straight after, like the day after.
Yeah, straight literally the day after. And obviously, just to clarify what I said, if someone of any age has to have their ovaries removed surgically, so very young, a teenager, that will put you straight into menopause.
Wow. And that must be really, really confronting and I know that this happens, and certainly people I've known, younger people who had various conditions where they had to have their ovaries removed, and going into menopause as a young person in your teens or 20s or even 30s is confronting. And I guess this is the part where you're saying about the biopsychosocial. So for people listening who may not be familiar with that phrase, bio being biology, psycho being the psychological, and the social being the environmental context, the social context that we all live in, whether we like it or not, where we're living in an environment that bends and shapes us. In relation to, to queer menopause, Tania, which is your specialty. So you've just completed a bunch of research and are in the process of publishing your findings on this research. What inspired you to sort of coin the phrase queer menopause, and what are your findings?
I mean, we could call it LGBTQ plus menopause. Just queer menopause seemed to flow together. I mean, it was conversations with friends, friends who were queer, friends who were non-binary, saying, what is going to happen to me in menopause? Particularly, for example, people who are maybe microdosing testosterone and things like that, and wondering, what is menopause going to mean? And for people who really don't really want to think about menopause because it makes them feel dysphoric. You know, there's something, people associate menopause with femininity and femaleness because we will insist on gendering everything. And so someone may really just not want to think about that going on in their body. And so people may sort of look away from it. So I called it queer menopause. Like I say, that phrase seems to cover a lot of things. I mean, I'll just talk about my study. I did a master's a couple of years ago, and like I said, all these conversations led me to think, no, I have to do this. There's almost nothing out there. There's some work on lesbian experience. There's some work on heterosexual cis women and lesbians and their experiences. But there wasn't anything much further than that. I was quite struck by it. There are various things around, but they're very much disparate. So I spoke to 12 people, and I talked to them all about different things. The biggest outcome was the difficulty of going to see doctors and therapists. The really difficult experiences people had with doctors who either weren't really prepared to engage with menopause or who weren't really prepared to engage with gender and sexuality. And people had some experiences ranging from invalidating to traumatic when trying to get help, and doctors sort of demanding to know, well, what are your genitals and what are you exactly, type of questions like this, or non-consensually writing prescriptions either for hormones or for antidepressants.
Wow.
Oh yes, I mean, this just to say, this experience is replicated among cisgender heterosexual women. That is the biggest group of people who has an ovary-driven menopause, if you like. And so that's already a group who's struggling with their interactions with the medical system. But for queer and trans people, there's a whole extra layer of what the hell am I going to find when I go to the doctor? What am I going to be asked? What am I going to have to keep explaining to them about? My study was initially focused on counseling and psychotherapy. It was also therapists that I asked people about, and therapists sort of interrogating people or sort of gaslighting them. And if people had to explain pronouns, for example, and having practitioners sort of, again, it's this sort of haggling. No, you have to tell me more about yourself. That was a big part of it, the really difficult experience. And the fact that all the sort of corollary to that is that therapists and doctors and medical staff really needing more training in gender, in sexuality, and in menopause. You've got these clashing sort of ists and isms of ageism coming from one side and potentially homophobia, biphobia, transphobia coming from the other.
It's because I think, menopause is perceived in broader culture as this extreme relationship with, as you were saying, femininity, an extreme relationship with fertility, which, in Western culture, and I think perhaps in many cultures, there is an overarching association between femininity and fertility that harkens back to, day dot. And so when we start looking at it, and even though, even in that context, menopause is barely understood, that most people, doctors and health professionals, still know very little about it, the physiological impacts of it. And then we add in the extra layer of, as you're saying, the transphobia, the biphobia, the health practitioners who struggle to understand all of the impacts that people living in queer bodies, people living in non-traditional gendered bodies also live with, and yet they still experience these hormonal fluctuations. And because culturally we associate hormones with gender, even though hormones are about as gendered as a grain of rice, not very.
Yes.
Having to navigate those extra layers and educating health professionals on how to de-gender something that really is a biological process and a biological phenomenon seems to be a lot of work for people.
It is a lot of work. I mean, it's deconstructing the gender binary we'd like to start with very young children so we can get this explained from the beginning. But then, of course, we need all the people to teach that to the very young children as they grow up. And then that means sort of uprooting that structure in people's minds across the board. And that's not easy.
So how did some of your study participants, how did they navigate that?
Well, with some difficulty. Some people had quite a sort of activist sensibility, and they went in there determined to get their way, and they had to be quite tough.
Yeah.
Some people reported quite hostile interactions with doctors. There was something that came up particularly challenging, and so much of what I'm mentioning here, it'd be great if researchers take all this forward into more detail, because there's the particular situation of someone who is approaching middle age, is considering transition at the same time as coming into menopause. And not only is that confusing on a number of levels, but also having to work with two sets of gatekeepers in the system. Right. Because if the person goes to the GP thinking, coming into menopause, and testosterone is given for menopause as well as estrogen, that's part of a discussion we can have. But having to take real care not to mention testosterone in case the doctor goes, no, you need to be going to the gender clinic, bye. So they might go to the gender clinic, but fear that if they mention menopause at the gender clinic, that the people there are going to go, well, no, you're not trans enough. You can't come in.
Right. So there's something about the word that is associated with cisnormativity.
Yes, very much so. Very much so, which makes people sometimes just not want to touch it. I've been wondering about new words for menopause, like euphemisms like the change, or this very old-fashioned word climacteric, which I think we don't want to use that.
I've never even heard that.
Yeah, that's
an oldie-worldy British word.
It's an oldie-worldy British word. I had a Belgian participant, and he translated what he'd heard as the end of the brothel in my pants, which I thought was quite funny.
It is. It's also very odd.
Well, yes, it is. But I think the point is going with the dropping of sexual desire. It's the paradoxes that menopause brings for people, whatever gender, whatever sexuality they are, that people sit with that are confusing on many levels.
Let's talk about the impact of this on sex and pleasure and intimacy and all of those things, because that's really what this podcast is about. The end of the brothel in the pants is pretty fascinating. So in addition to navigating the tedium of having to explain things like pronouns to health professionals, which really is, I think, in 2021 as we are now, unacceptable. It should be part of the very, very bog standard training that health and medical professionals get. The association around sex and the kind of sex people have with their various gender identities and their various genital configurations. What did your research show of queer menopause on sex and relationships?
Well, actually, queerness is potentially a protective factor here, because people, of course, will not be mainly focused on penis and vagina sex. They might be having vaginal entry sex, but PIV, which is one of the cornerstones of the sort of menopause challenge for cishet women, is obviously less in the foreground here, and much less in some cases, because that's when your body really does change. And if you're relying on vaginal sex as your main sex life, you may be in some trouble there. And this is why I talk about menopause. The way we respond to menopause represents a huge failure of sex education. People falling into PIV, or the sex escalator. Well, a bit of manual, bit of oral, penis enters vagina, end of story. And if that's what your sex life has been built around, and you haven't gone beyond that, there are many good reasons why people don't. They don't think it's for them, or they think that's for those people over there, or don't know it's there, or whatever else. People are quite likely to struggle, because we have, I don't want to get too focused on the vagina, but in a way we can't avoid that, because obviously many people of many identities have vaginal sex, or the vagina plays a part. So we have a thing which used to be called vaginal atrophy, which is absolutely a horrific phrase, and it basically means the walls of the vagina become much thinner and the tissues around there become much thinner, and they just lubricate a lot less, and the skin can be much more fragile, and blood flow is less, and it's just generally painful. Now we would call it genitourinary symptoms of menopause. So GSM. So I'm glad to see GSM being gradually pushed out by people more, because
that's a much more user-friendly phrase.
It's much more user-friendly, and really it comes as a shock to people when they find perhaps orgasms harder and harder to lubricate, and also entry sex, vaginal sex just becomes too painful. And that includes obviously examinations at the gynecologist. Certainly from discussions with people, self-massage, vaginal internal massage, can certainly help blood flow. Now obviously some people have never been penetrated and don't wish to, for all sorts of reasons, but I would be saying that you probably will end up having vaginal examinations at the doctors for health reasons, smear tests, if you have pain, something else. And so it might be good to dilate. That it's not necessarily to do with vaginismus, but it might be good to dilate just in case. Obviously there is a trauma red flag there. Not everyone wants things inside themselves. So what that forces on everyone is creativity. And actually lots of people didn't perhaps enjoy entry sex or vaginal sex that much in the past anyway, but sort of gritted their teeth because genitals, because escalator. And so I think actually coming into menopause, if you still desire to have sex, is a time where you can be creative with your whole body. We know there's breath work, there's different forms of touch that aren't genital, there's anal sex, and obviously there's kink. There's all different directions you can go into, and actually for many people I think that's quite liberating.
Absolutely. And did you find with your research participants, as they were navigating this experience of dealing with the medical professions as one arm of their experience of this hormonal shift, and then for those who had identities other than female, what impact did they report on their relationship with sex and pleasure moving forward, if they had flagged that sex and pleasure of genitals was something that interested them previously?
Perhaps a different relationship with pleasure, because one of the cruel things about menopause is that libido can drop.
Right.
Now, taking testosterone, for example, will help with that, whatever gender you are. There's the whole idea of wanting to want, which I know you've talked about yourself in talks. It's also negotiating. If someone doesn't feel desire anymore, when there's such a pressure from society to be sexual, it's a struggle to negotiate that. It's very hard to say, I'm so sorry, but I don't think I'm a sexual person anymore. I can do physical stuff, I can do all these things, but I don't know if I want to call this sex now. I would like to do more sex-specific research around this, because sex was a part of what I was asking about, but it wasn't the huge part. I think queerness, the creativity that comes with it, and the different ways of seeing one's body and how we interact with others is protective against these aspects of menopause.
Absolutely. And I think, that's what's so crucial about this, and I really look forward to you pursuing research around this if that's what you decide to do with it, because the learnings that have come out of queer theory with regard to sex practices, beyond any kind of menopausal anything, just in general, queer sex as it's referred to broadly, which can be practiced by all kinds of people, is essentially the notion that sex does not have to be based around penis and vagina, whether there's penises and vaginas even involved in it, that it allows us to start thinking about sex in ways that center other motivations, which might include pleasure, which might include connection, which might include power, which might include, validation. I want you to like me. So there's literally hundreds of reasons that people engage in sex, and we know that from other research. And what seems to consistently come through is that queer communities have always, and I think will always, lead the charge in helping us redefine what these things mean. So going back to what you were saying, Tania, about where the bulk of your research was, what were some, say the top 3 things that really stood out to you on the research, not necessarily in relation to sex and pleasure, but in relation to the thrust, as it were, of your research? What were some of the main things that you discovered?
That training of practitioners, whether therapists, medical healthcare, around gender and menopause and aging needs to be so much better. There was several, and that was a main one.
And so what kind of things do they need to be trained in? What do they need to learn?
Non-binary genders, all about different genders, presentation, identification, all that kind of thing, different ways people might have sex. And then menopause, and of course this cuts across the whole menopausal population.
Right.
What it might be, the fact that you shouldn't just throw antidepressants at somebody, an education around hormones. It was felt that we could all do with it. I'm still seeking someone to lecture a group of therapists around hormones. I've been looking for like a year and a half now, a paid gig to just with someone, sex hormones, obviously sex hormones particularly.
So if there's somebody listening for whom that is their jam, that they should reach out to you, huh?
Yes, they should.
Okay.
A webinar for therapists so we can ask lots of questions, because lots of therapists I know something about hormones, perhaps because it's their own hormonal makeup. We start to understand our own, and then putting that jigsaw puzzle together and saying, okay, these and hormonal interactions, and how different are we from each other, and at what level of testosterone knocks out menopause completely, for example. And then just to also mention, it isn't just people with ovaries. I mean, people assigned male at birth, trans women may also experience menopause-like effects. Hormonal transition happens to all bodies in middle age of some sort, anybody. And so hence, just coming back to what we were saying before, as hormones are just not gendered. All bodies need testosterone, estrogen and progesterone to function. Right. But I know many people may hold back from getting the help they need because they think they're going to be feminized or masculinized. And it would be great if people could all be educated around that, because that's not what this is. But we're so hung up on the gender binary that's what happens. Therapists and healthcare people overall really need to acknowledge their queer menopausal clients' experiences rather than make assumptions. And I think everywhere people love to make assumptions. And this was a big thing that came up, is that please stop making assumptions about us. Do the work and listen. Hence the conflicts that came up between some people and their doctors, basically.
Yes. Yeah.
It's important for people to know that queer menopausal clients have probably had previous negative experiences in the healthcare system and in life. Life in general, transphobia, biphobia, etc., and ageism. And so struggling to find their way through this, people are going to be braced for more. Some of these experiences were genuinely traumatic.
So this is the psychosocial part.
Yes. Generally, information about menopause that's currently available is inadequate. It's changing. It is absolutely changing, and there is a bunch of activists out there shouting. And now it's gone to discussions with members of parliament in this country, and it's now on the school curriculum, thanks to tireless menopause activists. But the information people reach for is still not good enough. I mean, I've got my Queer Menopause website, and I've been putting some resources on there. We need more resources, and it also means that both therapists and practitioners and their clients, that the queer person in menopause, may be holding inaccurate information about menopause. So we're all sitting with what we don't know, but we don't know what we don't know.
And I think that's the part that's potentially, the word that's coming to mind is dangerous, which is a word that I don't like to throw around because it tends to evoke panic in people.
Yes.
And a lot of the folks who listen to this podcast are health professionals as well as lay people. And it's so important for us as clinicians or coaches or whatever we are to keep up our training and to keep up our training in really disparate disciplines, so we can be across this stuff, so we can serve clients in the best possible way without saying stuff that's inadvertently offensive or just ignorant
or harmful.
And harmful, right.
To go along with the assumptions thing is, it's important not to assume that menopause is entirely negative for people. And I'm aware that I often talk about the negative side of things because there are so many people struggling. But of course, lots of people are absolutely delighted when their periods end and when they can't get pregnant anymore. Absolutely delighted. Certain medical issues can get better in menopause sometimes, hormone-based ones. And there's also a less easy to define sense of freedom and change. Queer menopause as a concept, obviously it's quite a wide umbrella, and there's this idea that many people coming into middle age, they evolve in terms of sexuality and in terms of gender. So that's a whole other piece about how do you see your gender. And I think for me personally, menopause has been a journey that's taken me in a great big loop back to when I was about 10. and, feeling pre-sexuality, pre-gender. Who was I really?
Yeah.
And that's been very exciting and very, very interesting. So there's a sort of parallel piece there around who am I becoming and what am I? And really, I think for me personally, the identity woman is something that I don't really hold anymore. So I'm not repelled by it. I'm not rejecting it. It's like I'm standing on the platform and, or no, actually, woman is staying on the platform when I'm on the train going on to the next, wherever I'm going next, because that's definitely a strong thing that's come up for me.
Yeah.
And of course, in terms of sexuality, some people may have gone off and had families and husbands and then come through that and go, actually, this isn't me anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so menopause has transformative aspects. I mean, I know that asexual people feel very left out of these discussions because there is such a focus on sex and the loss of sex and how that is a tragic thing, or seen by some to be tragic. I think that can make people feel really quite not listened to. And the state of non-sexuality that some people in menopause reach isn't the same as asexuality.
For sure, it's important to make that distinction that asexuality is understood as an orientation, not a symptom or a reaction to other life circumstances.
We need more research about how neurodiversity and menopause work together, because menopause can bring memory loss.
Yes, you don't
brain
hear
fog.
much about that.
We don't, and I would also like to do some more research, or at least look at this, because it's essential. I think menopause, for some people, is its own form of neurodiversity, and it needs to be named as such.
That's a really interesting point.
Oh, yeah. No, I've independently of menopause, I've also been looking into this. There's so much here.
Tania, it's just, your knowledge on this is just fascinating, and I really appreciate you taking time out to speak to the audience of The Erotic Philosopher about your research, and I really look forward to any more that you develop, and I'd certainly love to have you come back as a guest. I'm going to put links to your website and your various social media feeds for people who want to follow up with you. And particularly, you're looking for people who are able to explain the relationship of hormones to clinicians, because you absolutely see a need for that, so folks can reach out to you, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm also interested if anyone would like to tell me, as anonymously as you like, about your experience as a queer menopausal person, either in therapy or the healthcare system or in life. That's very welcome. I'd like to put something on my website. So if anyone would like to share anything, it's most welcome.
Okay, so folks listening to that, you can make sure you reach out to Tania using the links that will be in the show notes. Tania, I really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us today.
And thank you so much for having me. It's been great to be able to talk about all this.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Tania Glyde and learnt more about the complexity and real diversity of menopause, which historically has been something that's secretive and shameful, when really it's just a part of life for a huge portion of the population. If you're enjoying The Erotic Philosopher, why don't you go ahead and rate and review us? Head on over to Apple Podcasts. Whether you're using Apple or not, you can still rate and review The Erotic Philosopher, which enables other people to find us. You can also follow us on social media. We are at The Erotic Philos, that's PHILOS, on Instagram and Twitter. To catch up with previous episodes of The Erotic Philosopher, head on over to my website. That's cindydarnell.com, CYNDIDARNELL.com. Select the podcast tab, where you will see previous episodes of The Erotic Philosopher, as well as links to leave questions for future philosophers to ponder. While you're there, consider checking out my online pleasure school, offering a suite of pre-recorded online classes about sex and relationships, ready for you to take in the privacy of your own home. If you'd like tailored support about your sex and relationship problems, reach out to me for private counseling and consulting work, also listed on the website. We're heading into the home stretch of season 2 of The Erotic Philosopher now, and I really appreciate your appreciation and attention. Thanks for listening.